Their core principles of visual expression, media adaptability, and typographic function. As a bi-coastal, LGBTQ+ and minority-owned studio with offices in Inglewood, California and Raleigh, North Carolina, Polymode ignites change to create social and sustainable impact, and they operate with the ethos of studio as family. Thank you so much, Brian and Silas, for being here today. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. As always, we have to ask that quintessential question. Can everyone see the screen? So hi, everybody. I'm Brian. I'm a partner at Polymode.
And I'm Silas. I'm a partner at Polymode.
So as always, we just like to ground everybody to say, this is what we're going to show you. This is a lot of stuff. I guess we're just going to show and do a little bit of like chit chat. I feel like for me, I just would love to have more of a conversation towards the end. But of course, I know y'all are here to see some books. So these are some of the things that we're going to show you.
Yeah, I'm personally, I don't know about you, Brian, but I'm like excited and kind of nervous. Like, I'll show you my book if you show me yours. Kind of thing. But I think we might probably fly through the studio profile, but then talk about product research because Jamie did such a good job of like summarizing our profile. But like the work that you see here today is like our work, but also the work of Randa and Michelle, who are two designers who we work with. And then also Audrey, who's not pictured, as our studio manager. So it's a lot of folks. As anyone who's made a book, all of y'all know, it's a lot of hands, but even within Polymode, we're like, we're very collaborative and, you know, have made projects for a lot of different places that you might be familiar with.
So I think one thing that makes Polymode different, special, stand out is that we have something that we call poetic research. So as many in the design field know, 9 times out of 10, hi, here's a very minimal amount of money for a lot of work. Can you make me this one thing? And that's all I care about. And it's very cut and dry and very capitalistic and very, you know, cobblers making shoes only. But for us in poetic research, we like to dive very deep into the subjects that are handed to us when we actually start a project.
Kind of building on that, I think to your point, Brian, it's like, for us, a book, we really dive deep and like we're book nerds and also really into research. But I think when you're designing a book and like working with content that's really specific, like an artist's body of work or a scholar's essay, like for us, we want to put intentionality in every decision, like the typefaces, the grid, and like how can that have this kind of like lateral, harmonic, energetic way of working. And I think for us, because we've been working remotely like for years, like pre-pandemic, we've lived before it was cool. And so one of the ways we kind of connect to each other is through making these like research decks. And part of that is also like making playlists and music for each other as a way to kind of like stay connected like across space and time. And then we've started sharing those with our collaborators as well. So we're going to just give a couple examples of like what we mean by poetic research. So like one example was this is not a book, but we designed an identity for the Orange County Museum of Art that was having a sort of like identity crisis as it was building a new building and wanting to raise money. But like one of the things we did was just like, oh, let's look at the light around this museum. And I'm a surfer. So we just started studying sunsets and this like shifting of light. And that became this poetic metaphor for the color palette for the institution. And then there were a number of other cues like for the type to the architecture of this new building. But that was like primarily the idea, the poetic idea of this sort of specific light color thing that then made a specific design action.
One of the other things that we focused on when we did the book for Mark Bradford for the Venice Biennale was that knowing that it was hosted in Venice And Mark's actual sort of like opening party was going to be at the Doge's Palace. We were looking at the architecture of the Doge's Palace. And then a lot of Mark's work for the Biennale was based on how does Black Reconstruction in America actually affect the Black body through space and through time. And so we were looking at the architecture and then found these patterns that we could also then lay over what we considered to be the Black body and build something and like fuse them together. And so you'll see that this is it's an all printed like Black spread. Then there's a varnish of the patterning for the windows that we have at the beginning of every single section. Do you want me to take this one, Silas?
Yeah, go for it.
So really quickly, beginning of the pandemic, we were asked by the Studio Museum of Harlem to make a box that was able to hold their F-show catalogs that some of you might know about that were done. And so we had this idea of like, what would it be to have Black opulence? Since they're all African-American artists and they're all contemporary, we focused very much on texture and feeling and style. And they're building a new building. And so the new building also has lots of different like pieces of material. And so we're trying to reference like these ideas of like, you know, a casual, but also like a very, you know, avant-garde way of saying what is Black excellence.
And like some of the structural details of the box also reference David Adjaye's work, who's the architect who's working on their new building. And he was like, he's been experimenting with like funky terrazzos where he's like pouring color into them and like really experimenting with like shape, and the building has this pretty intense cantilever to it. So we were trying to find a way to like put that architectural metaphor into the structure of the box. And it's interesting that one of the F shows was actually Mark Bradford's first show, the Thelma Golden curated him into freestyle. So that was that first catalog there.
We also worked on a new sort of like forward that was done by Thelma. And so they asked us to design this as well. And so we were then playing on that cantilevered idea for the typography in her new essay as well. Silas,
yeah, sure, I can talk about this one. So this is a show that's actually still up. It's actually about to come down. It's at the New Museum, and it's a project that was long running. It was envisioned by the Nigerian curator Okui Enzor, who is very influential in the art world, unfortunately passed at the beginning of 2019. And he had been collaborating with a number of curators at the New Museum, Massimiliano Gianni, Glenn Ligon, who was an artist that he had a relationship with, Naomi Beckworth, and Mark Nash. And the four of them basically took over. It was one of his last shows. He planned it to open during the election, the presidential election, 2020 election, because he was very interested in this charged idea around white grievance and Black grief. So the cover, and part of our product research, which we were looking at a lot of like both protest graphics. So there's a reference to the Eye of a Man poster that was around Martin Luther King Jr.'s last rallies and speeches related to the Memphis sanitation worker strike of 1968. And we were also looking at like funerary, like Black Bibles, like literally in Black churches, funeral postings, newspaper reports, and like all of that sort of fused into the typographic language of the book. You can keep going. So there's this kind of like reportage aesthetic, because a lot of Black grief is like on display, like from Emmett Till's death in the late 50s, which sparked like the beginning of the civil rights movement, to now Black Lives Matter. You know, we wanted there to be this combination of the present and the sort of like news, but also like memorial, and have space and a sort of gravitas. I don't know, Brian, if you want to talk about the type a little bit.
Sure. I will actually take a step back so you can just see the type for a second. We actually approached XYZ with Ben Keel and Jesse to see if they could actually use one of their old typefaces. Egyptine, was it a serif first, Silas? And then we asked them to make it into a sans.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about the light wells and the heavier focuses of like where the actual ink will sit, and the fact that it was very tight, it was very like high. You can see in sort of like how the R works and how the G works, that when you consider what is the condition of Black life in mourning, is that it's compressed and it's heavy. And so there was something about this that we really wanted to sort of live in the typography, and it needed to be its own thing. Like we wanted to have something that was very specific for this publication. And then of course there's an extremely modular grid. It's very, very concise and very sort of like stayed, because we had to hold space for it. Many different artists, and with very, very heavy sort of subject matter.
Yeah,
So
and I think I really appreciated like Phaidon, like they pushed us to really like get into the grid. Like in it, I love like baseline grids that like overlap and connect, but like they, I don't know, between them and the new museum, I think there was like it was a good challenging process where it kind of pushed us to really like think about every decision and like the pacing of imagery and the rhythm, because it's so many different artists, from very young emerging artists to Jack Whitten, you know, who's like an OG of Black abstract painting.
Oh, now let's hop into a book that I think someone here in the room knows a lot about. So about this time last year, we were asked by Tom to design this great catalog for Terry Atkins at the Pulitzer. And we had an absolute blast doing this. And Tom realizes and now knows that we love to make really cool playlists, and they're really awesome, and, you know, kind of do it well. So we were looking at how to meld the actual space of the Pulitzer, you know, which is in a Tadao Ando building, and they're very long, and there also are other cantilevers. And so we're trying to reference both the art of Terry Atkins with the building and the time frame. And so the space is also poured concrete. And so there's this aspect of like, what does resounding mean, especially with the word? And this was something big for us, is that Terry Atkins, as he was working towards the end of his life, was really listening a lot to the Missa Solemnis by Beethoven. And so we listened to that a lot ourselves. And there is something about these lines that, and like this sound that sort of has it echoes. And as we know in contemporary architecture, with any poured concrete, there is this resounding sort of like flow of ether as the sound moves. And so we wanted that to then relate into the printing of the book. And so as you can see here, the end papers then bleed into the half title, which then bleeds into the title, which then bleeds into the table of contents. And there's always this idea that the sound is continuing as the book itself progresses.
That's awesome. Tom just dropped in the chat the playlist, the resounding playlist, which is cool. So that's like part of that extension of like this perfect example of that poetic research, and like how it kind of just, I feel like what we do, sometimes we feel like, I don't know, I feel like book design is like these insignificant gestures sometimes, but then like people who appreciate it, and also I think that impromptu family that gets created, community that gets created when you make a book, I think is, I don't know about you, Brian, but like I love that as much as the actual artifact, is like the stories and the conversations and the changed perspectives that come from putting something like this together.
I mean, I would completely mirror that and say, that's kind of why we're here. One of the things that we also really loved is that most of this artwork was photographed both you know, by the Pulitzer, but also was photographed in situ. And so we were able to use different views of the actual work. Terry actually would take objects and then change them, paint on them, make them into something else. And so there's this idea that, especially for us at Polymode, and for me when I'm laying out books, is that if you can't be in the museum and you can't walk and look all around the different sides, when this book is opened 10, 15, 20 years from now, can you still give the viewer what it felt like to be in that space in that time? And so that's why when we actually built this grid and moved through it, we actually want to give everyone like this aspect of, again, space and being able to walk around and see details that we also found to be beautiful. And so then you can see here where this is where the cantilevered idea of the grid and the blocks of type and how everything melds together still has this sort of echoing that then goes through the piece itself.
Yeah, literally the images resound across spreads.
then
Yeah, there's
one
that
of,
distinctive space. So beautiful. This is sort of like one of the pains of COVID where you're like, we didn't get to see this show in person. Like you're like, you would want to, normally that's something you could do, but it's like, oh, I think this is great that we're circling back to Mark. So this is just a little bit more of what we were talking about in the poetic research, but you can see this dust jacket and then type underneath the dust jacket, which I think for us was like really powerful, that this artist was like, no type on the cover, like let's just let it be his painting. And then you have this sort of architectural spine, because as was alluded to before, Mark was thinking a lot about architecture and the contrast between the architecture of Venice, Italy, and this idea of like Southern California, South Central, where Mark grew up, and this kind of urban grid of Los Angeles. If you want to go to the next one, Brian. And so we were playing with that idea of grid and structure underneath the book. The book actually has two different grids. It has like a neoclassical grid and then kind of more of a modular modern grid that overlap, and they interact with each other. And so we used that portrait sans inline type to sort of reference this idea of inscriptional lettering in Venice, but then paired it with a Klim typeface, Founders Grotesque, that was like condensed and kind of more referencing type that sort of like spanned Mark's lifetime and sort of like the beginning of his life. He was doing a lot of reflection on himself and like this vulnerable Black body, and then also thinking about how that related to like construction and deconstruction of culture and society, especially for marginalized people over time. And so he was also referencing and dealing with this like neoclassical like ideas of art and sculpture. This was his Medusa that was like in one of the galleries. And so we're kind of playing off these ideas of like, yeah, there you go. You can see that grid up there on the left where you see the Bayard, like the honey court, but then it's overlaid on this like very like gridded thing. And so we were constantly playing with that tension between sort of like pasts and presence. And then the system also articulated to like mobile invitations. So it kind of had this kind of like shifting quality to it, even though it had a similar lockup.
So right before COVID happened, about a year before, we were approached by the Cooper Hewitt to do both the identity, the catalog, and the help do the what's the word I'm looking for? So it starts with a D, and like
Design.
Didactics. There it is.
Didactics.
Ooh, that brain.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
So we were asked to do that. I was like, it is a Saturday. And let me tell you, it's the afternoon on the East Coast, ladies and gentlemen.
Someone get him another coffee, please.
Needed. So we were asked to do that for a fashion designer named Willie Smith, who is also a queer person of color who died tragically of AIDS. And so we launched in deeper into this as well, because as two queer men, we wanted to then uplift a voice that these are the sort of men and women that would have been our mentors, and like they're dead. And so we wanted to then dive into this even deeper to understand like who was Willie Smith, and we found out, you know, how collaborative he was. And so working on this project, I think, really changed our studio. Not that Silas didn't already have this idea of collaboration, but that the fact that he wanted to share everything with everyone that he worked with, and everyone got credit. And it was just this big sort of understanding that it was really very, very important for us to then dive into this. And I think it's what makes it one of our sort of favorite projects that we've done in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I feel like he was polymodal. And it's interesting because like he was very good friends with Dan Friedman, which we knew about, and was like one of the few queer graphic designers like in design history. But like, why the fuck did we not know about Willie Smith? I mean, he's super successful. He collaborated with Keith Haring and Jean-Claude and Christo, and like, you know, had Beth Ann Hardison as one of his models. Like he was like a superstar. His business ended up earning $25 million a year at the height of its prime. I'm like super into this time because I've been watching the Halston series on Netflix, and it's like there needs to be a Willie Smith. Like he was just so outspoken. He was critical and didn't want to be considered a Black designer. He wanted to be considered a designer. He was ahead of his time. Like if you look at Virgil Abloh's clothes, he heavily like led streetwear, what we now call like non-binary clothing, unisex clothing, streetwear, affordable, accessible clothing. Like he was just so radical.
And one of the things that he did in one of his showrooms is that, you know, he went to the piers. I mean, like for all of us that know the piers in New York City in the 70s and 80s, it was the place to be and get bean. And so there's this idea of the grayness of the city and poured concrete. And so when Site Architects did one of his big showrooms in New York City, they brought the street into the actual showroom and built a sort of like, I'll go back so you guys can see, and built this very urban environment. But then they painted everything gray. And so this warm gray sort of color is what we use to actually walk through the book, because it gives a sense of both ghosting. And so that's what we have at the beginning of each section. We would have a photograph that's in the next page, but then be in before, and it's ghosted because there's not that much that people are still trying to glean all this information about Willie together and sort of like not reconstruct a narrative, but get back into like a very broader narrative of who he was and what his impact was. And so we had these moments of sort of like ghosting and pulling back that we actually used within the
which was like kind of a parallel to the curator's process, who was basically like building the archive and building the story in real time. I mean, they were finding his garments on eBay. They were like talking to people who had stories. If you want to keep going, and I think to that point, Brian, we were like trying to balance this idea of memory, ghosting, but also cutting edge, right? So turning type, like having it literally come to the edge of signage, of the text block, which made people very nervous at the museum, but also kind of was like about him pushing the edge. And in some ways, we ended up collaborating with Site on the exhibition design, as well as a new Sam Chermayeff architect, younger architecture group, to kind of contrast this like Carnegie Mansion with this like very cutting edge downtown fashion designer and artist.
And then we also just had to make a system that could also go onto the web. You know, with Cargo Collective, how could they take all of our work and make it work for desktop, mobile? How does it look? How does the type work? You know, how does the grid work? And so all of this was like running in parallel as we designed the book and the show and this all at the same time. It was a lot. Jacob Lawrence. So
yeah, why don't you go first, Brian?
Sure. This is the first project that Silas and I did as a book together. Silas was living in Miami at the time. I was here in Raleigh, and Silas was visiting New York, had just gone to see Leah Dickerman, and she asked him to do this book. And if I remember correctly, Silas, you called me almost when you left the museum. You're like, hey, I'm gonna need some help.
Yeah.
Kind of book about Jacob Lawrence. And we both screamed with joy and had an absolute blast doing this piece together.
I think this was kind of the formulation of this idea of like call and response between us. And I mean, I think it's, you know, we're doing the Seattle Art Book Fair, and Jacob and Gwendolyn Knight, his wife, you know, end up there and have like a huge impact on that city. And, you know, we're just in the previous panel talking about the gallery named after him. And I think we didn't know exactly what we're getting into, and it like really set up all the things in our practice. There's literal poetry in this book. So in addition to restaging all of the series, which are 60 egg tempera paintings that are in this very graphic style about this like major shift of Black folks from the South to escape Jim Crow, were paired with contemporary African-American poets. And even the titles and the way we were treating the panel titles, which he reworded in the 90s when they were shown again, were kind of like lines of poetry. And so we have this like scale contrast in the plates, which is sort of an unusual choice for plates, right? Like we seem to like have something that's more quiet, but this notion of the blues and using Eames, this kind of slab serif that was sort of pointing to the 1940s when Jacob displayed this show for the first time right on the eve of Pearl Harbor. And we were sort of playing with this idea of also like, if you keep going, like how do you have a poetry chapbook also live in an art catalog? And so having a grid that had this kind of flexibility so that it could deal with like very gridded structured poems like this. And I think there were other kind of really expressive, like projective poems. So it kind of really cemented this idea of like, oh yeah, poetic research, like the poetry and the logic of a text or the content can shape the design.
Great force. We were asked to help make a catalog for a show called The Great Force at the ICA in Richmond, Virginia, by Ambrose Cedia. And it's pretty much about how the great force of history and racism pretty much impact us and push forward just the crushing megalith that is contemporary age. And with that essay of White Men's Guilt by James Baldwin, we used a typeface that was designed by Trey Seals, William, which was based on W.E. Du Bois's graphics for the World's Fair in 1900s. And we were influenced by those actual drawings, which Silas has written quite a lot about, so I will pass this to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Du Bois is major because he's like a paradigm shifter in terms of graphic design history, a sociologist who made these very abstract proto-modernist posters and diagrams, but also used this type that came from engineering templates because they were not trained as designers, but as sociologists. And so when Amber and we were talking about the book, she invited us to create these things that I'm blanking on the term, other devices. Thank you. Speaking of trying to find your words. Well, because like in one of his plates, Du Bois talks about, he's like, this is evidence of the equality of Black people, like in the United States, charts, diagrams, and other devices, which was like, we were like, whoa, that's such an interesting term. And so as we were like talking to Amber, she was like, what if you take Du Bois's aesthetics of diagrams and make contemporary data visualizations that connect to data that's related to artists' work? So like, for instance, Kevin Beasley works a lot with cotton. And so we mapped cotton belt states where cotton has historically been highly produced and connected to chattel slavery in the United States. And so there's this kind of echo between history and the present.
One of the main parts of the piece as well is that Amber wanted to re-earth and bring back to the forefront that this has been written about a lot and it's still here. And so we reprinted Frederick Douglass's Color Line, James Baldwin, White Man's Guilt, and Nell Irving Painter's The History of White People, a small selection. And so with these three different reprints, we wanted to look at the way in which they were written. So Frederick Douglass had his newspaper in a classic typography setting that's going to be very tight, like very narrow columns. James Baldwin did essays. Most essays in most magazines are going to be 2 columns. And then Nell Irving Painter, as an actual book, published as a book, we gave it 1 column. So using Dapper and Josh Jardin's typeface, we wanted to be able to show this, but have each of them be their own thing, but also still give a complete nod back to historical typographic layouts. And then it also been translated into the space itself.
So the final project we're going to talk about is called Past Due. It was a report for the LA mayor's office. You can see Eric Garcetti, that's the mayor of LA, holding our book, which we were pretty gagged about. He said he was like all up in it. And when we were talking about typography, he was smiling, which was like kind of crazy. But the report is really powerful. It's this committee of historians and architects and scholars, indigenous activists met for 18 months. They started meeting before COVID-19 and continued meeting through ongoing pandemic. And basically the book, and there's also a digital website, offer recommendations for how Los Angeles can reconcile its past, especially around whitewashing and the erasure of immigrants and minorities and people of color. And so this is great. You can see kind of like a zoomed out view of the various like parts of the report, which included photo essays, documentation of things like Kobe Bryant memorials, history of Black architects, particularly influenced by Paul R. Williams, who's like often not related. Yes, the colors are juicy, and we're definitely related to this idea of like sun-drenched, washed out Los Angeles. And of course, like concrete. Christopher Hawthorne, who's the design director of the LA Mayor's Office, wrote an essay that was looking at the history of Los Angeles through this framework of the highway and freeway, the garden, and then what was the other element?
River.
The river. So the LA River, which, you know, was a natural river, but then got turned into this like concrete and problematic issue in terms of like sustainability. And now we're actually in LA, like looking to change all of that and kind of return it to more ecological sustainability. So this section was talking about monuments, markers, and layers of space, particularly around the way that indigenous land is erased and ignored, and how might we, not even specific proposals, but how might we use consensus and community feedback to actually respond to and reconfigure Los Angeles as a city that welcomes all and all of its history.
And like Silas said about color and how we're actually washing it about because of the sun and that sort of contextualization of California, the red we also used for very specific things. And so you have a round table where an entire group of people could come together, but that red and the connotation of red with anger and violence and something that is like very pinpointing, you can point out, especially within the graphic design use, there's a lot of footnotes when you have a report. Because praise be to, you know, good academics that want to come in and be like, and let me tell you where I got this information from. And so when you go to the website, you can actually see that you can turn on the notes and they're actually within the block of type itself. But when you design a book, you have to make sure that you can pull those notes out. We didn't want them to be endnotes, but we also didn't want them to be footnotes. And so when we worked on this grid, very much as a report, we didn't want to read the report as, you know, like 2-column grid. We wanted it to be something that we could actually read it. It was more of a report or a story, but we knew that the footnotes were going to be very, very prominent. And so you'll see that just where they all follow within the piece itself, but there were also case studies and there were photo essays. And so we had to be able to build a structure and a system that could hold these things, accordion out, and then squeeze back in on the website. But when you're in print, you can't squeeze back in. So we had to make sure that there's enough finesse that we could get through the whole report.
We also had a mobile version of the site. A little bit about the type. So the type is from 2 generations of type designers from Los Angeles. So the display type Mola or Maria of Los Angeles comes from Roberta Rodriguez's research into an 1811 battle flag of the Mexican revolutionary Miguel Hidalgo Bandera. And he used inscriptional lettering that references Catholic missions. And also in Los Angeles, you'll see, you know, Maria's like murals everywhere. And so it was interesting how like Roberto was able to like go in his own kind of like typographic innovation through history. And there's something about, he was also adding these ornaments too, which kind of felt related to architecture, but also kind of like maybe like non-Western histories of type in a way, or in terms of visual communication. And so that was then paired with a couple typefaces from Greg Lindy, who's an amazing type designer for Lux Typo and was Roberto's type design teacher. So it's really cool to have these kind of like different generations of type designers and like more inclusivity and more visibility and, you know, a history of type design, which was like pretty much very white bro led.
But especially that was his teacher, this understanding that you can actually pass on a lineage, and you can also then like anchor it into a city that you both love and come from different backgrounds.
Right. And
like,
sort of transcend our kind of like origins, but also while being true to them. Yes. Thanks so much. So yeah, let's open it up and let's talk books and anything that came up for people. There's been a lot of thoughtful comments. Thank you in the chat, and also some links for further reading too.
don't speak once.
It is Saturday.
Yeah, totally
we're all feeling that. You touched on this a little bit at the very beginning. I'll talk a little bit first, and if folks have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or speak out during this time. We are a small community here, and that's really fun and loves to talk about books. But something that I think both Tom and I really enjoy, and you've talked about in the past, is your playlist and music as a form of research for these projects. And it's something that's really, it's so lovely that you also, it's like an act of generosity as well, to offer to the people that come together when it comes to making a book, the commissioners, the editors, the other photographers and artists that you're working with. So yeah, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about the playlist process.
Most certainly. So the playlist process literally comes from I'm a book nerd, via also like mysticism and philosophy. And if you go back to the idea of your elements, you have 5 elements, or so say the Greeks, and the 5th element is ether. But ether is not an actual physical dense thing. Ether is the space between 2 objects, right? And so everything sort of can hang in ether. Music hangs in ether. And so for me personally, to be able to get everyone to understand the same space at the same time, which is extremely hard when we all have different realms of being and places and time frames and time zones, that if you build a body of music which can then sing to not your brain, but your heart and the physical emotions around you, and you can affect the sound in a room, which then will actually affect your body, that if everyone is listening to the same thing, doesn't have to be at the same time or in the same order, that you at least have some form of consistency that exists in a creative sort of zone. And when Silas and I started with Jacob Lawrence, I'm just, because we were talking about the blues, it was very much the Miles Davis prestige recordings. It was very much, the blues artists of New York City in that time, and Bessie Smith. And what are the people that are also dealing with life and processing that through music? And it's easy for us to say, hey, Silas, put this on liminal space. Yes. So that's kind of like how the playlist started.
Yeah, and I think then it just became this thing where it's like a ritual, right? Like it worked for that first book we did together, and then became this like thing that we would just start gathering songs as we were also making these decks and like looking at references. And I feel like it's that specificity of certain sonic things that also have repercussions or like relate to the visual choices that we're making. And then like all those things set a mood, they set a structure, they set an experience for a reader and viewer. And they're also just fun to do. So it's kind of, I think, sometimes like it's stressful to be a designer, or like there's things that are crunchy or like monotonous, or I don't know, it brings it brings joy to us and to people that we work with. And I think it's disarming, which I think is also helpful for collaboration.
And to be honest, I procrastinate really, really bad. Even as a type A, like Capricorn, who is so like going. Truly, if I don't want to do work, I can go down rabbit holes of music and just get lost and pull things into a playlist and not have to think about life for a while. And honestly, I'm very okay with that. And then some great it comes out of it at the same time. So I'm like, if that's what we need right now, then that's what we get.
Yeah, that is probably one of the most productive procrastination methods I've ever heard about. So that's fantastic. Have you all always been remote? I think like never sharing a space together, except maybe.
I mean, we lived together, but we weren't formally making design projects at that point. Like we were collaborating on things, but
No, we did Mystic Grids. Like, cause like,
oh,
there are-
that's
we did Mystic Grids. There
true.
are
We
so
need
many
to pull
little
out the
things that we
Mystic Grids
did, but it's like when
thing.
you
I
live
forgot
with your,
about that. Yeah.
you know, like when you live with your
Yeah.
best friend, it's like, hey, look at this. Is this shit? Should I change this? Like, and like it just, it becomes like so de rigueur. And then with Silas teaching at NC State, of course I'm always going to go in and like peek over his shoulder and be like, what are you working on? Like, what's going on over here? You know, like, so I don't know, what is work? Do we have to get paid to formalize it to say that we're actually working together? Can I just like beat his ass in Mario Kart and also call that work? I mean, isn't it like the same thing?
Wait, what is this Mystic Grids?
Mystic
thing?
Grits.
Grits.
Grits, as in
Oh.
like,
It's a memoir of one of
I mean, but
the
now
people
we're gonna
that
have to do
Brian
some
worked
Mystic
with.
Grits. I
We
mean,
have to like unearth that. It was a book that we designed together. Sort of, you more designed it than me, but yeah, that was like a very interesting collaboration. And like I forget, it's like the prequel. Oh my gosh, I'm kind of gagged right now.
Oh, that's so
Rosie,
lovely.
I would love to, Rosie, would you like to ask your question? You don't have to, I can also read it out loud too. Do you have your own, not really, got it. Do you have your own layout and production? Yes and no. 9 times out of 10, we do all the layout and production. I mean, like layout is in like design layout. We most certainly do. Sometimes, as Tom knows, we have used a typesetter that will then flow the type and then we go back in and clean it. But for most actual books, except for 2 that we've done, we do everything.
Yeah, and that part 2 part that you are asking about, Rosie, about like changing body text, which like a book designer's worst nightmare, but it has happened like sometimes late in the project of like letting needs to shift, or like something goes up half a point or 1 point, but that's when style sheets are your friend. And just like finding ways to kind of like automating. I know that does sound terrifying. We really try to avoid that, and like that's partly like why the all the poetic research, like part of that is also like how many words fit in this typeface, like will it work for this kind of paper, or like all of those decisions are kind of interconnected for us.
And we have, and usually by the time when we, before we even start like the first design concepts, if we know that the book is possibly 2 different sizes and we might be using 2 to 3 different typefaces, if we know a certain curator and what that curator, if the curator has written something, we will find what they've written and copy and paste it into our copy blocks, because every person that's a writer also has a very specific typographic way of what are their word lengths, how many commas do they use. And so like if you're going to flow something by Toni Morrison versus flowing something, you know, by like Baudelaire, like it's going to be very, very different. And like our word choices, the time frame. And so if we can go in and rough flow it, get some styles that we like, but then we change it and put it into a different size, we can then test it and see how many words fit into 1 column, how many words fit into 2 columns. If we lower it halfway to the page, if we put an image on the page, you can do all that really quickly up front. So then you can kind of tell, is this a good typeface or not at that time before you even approach the client. Might take you an hour, might take you an hour and a half, you know, even if you're really sort of like just getting started. It's a great way of just testing out your grid and your sizes.
Vanessa asks, do you mostly work digitally? Yes and no. I mean, in terms of the laying out and the typesetting and like placing images, yes, we're like digital, and mostly working in InDesign. It's interesting because we've also been experimenting with Figma, which is like a, you know, digital prototyping tool, but we've been using it to make presentations, and like it's nice because you can actually have like multiple people touching something at once, so that helps us when we're like iterating and sketching. It has its drawbacks. I feel like that's actually like, if you could make a page layout software where multiple people can be touching the book at the same time, that would be like, that's like $1 billion idea or something.
You just gave away.
I know, but like I'm just saying, it's like it's one thing to have the idea, it's another thing to actually make that. But then in terms of like just we're religious about printing things out and like seeing it at scale and like testing. We've been doing more and more press tests as part of the process too, just to like see the actual ink on the actual paper and like make decisions, because we've learned the hard way that like subtle details, if you don't get them quite right, it can ruin the book. It can like just, you're just like, oh, it was so close. And then it's like, like the paper doesn't feel right, or doesn't lay flat, or it doesn't do certain something that you just really need to test.
I have a quick question about how some of your projects have like a digital counterpart. And without like getting too heavy on the digital stuff, like I'm curious how you balance a print publication versus something that's a digital experience.
I think we're still figuring that out because they're just such different workflows. There's such different processes. I think what does glue them together is like systems, you know? And so I think that having typographic and visual systems and like, and also the idea of what is the idea of the identity and how does that connect them. So I feel like civic memory is a good example of like this idea of horizontality and like the landscape of Los Angeles. Even though the book is a portrait thing, there was a lot of, that was sort of something we were thinking about. I think color kind of knit them together. But then when it was also like came to designing, say, the homepage, it's like not like the cover. And even the way the maps work were so different that you had to just conceive of the process in such a different way, and in the way content comes through, and the fact that web is fluid and a book is fixed, and that affects things like grids and structures. And you can then also, like on the homepage of Past Due, you can enter the report in a nonlinear way. I mean, I guess you can kind of do that with a book where you like you do experience a book that way, but it's just such a different concept. I don't know, Brian, if you have other thoughts about like balancing those two.
Yes and yes no. It's like, this is the funny thing when I think about doing any sort of digital, interaction. I mean, it's still grid. You still have to have a margin on the left and a margin on the right, and it, like, though you have to think about it in like 4D, and you have to think about it in terms of like, you have the object that then turns, and you have to deal with that as well. You're still going to have a header and a footer and like margin on the left and the right. It just means you have to think about one shift then causes what to a power of 2 or a power of 3, but you still need to think about clarity. You still need to think about legibility and who's reading it. But if you really know the basic forms of accessibility and good typography, it does sort of translate. At the same time, I'm sure there are many people in here that are really good at UX UI who could walk in and be like, that's total crap, but like, we're trying to figure that out. And it's still, it's a moving target as you're working with it. And it's almost like it's a rose, right? It looks really pretty and it smells good, but if you grab it wrong, it also like totally pricks you. And like, like, I don't really know any other way of kind of like approaching it, because every single project in that sort of realm is always its own beast, right? Any notable projects? There's a great new exhibit that will be opening at the Baltimore Museum of Art about the Great Migration, and the show is moving from the Mississippi Museum of Art and then traveling to the Baltimore Museum of Art, just like most of the individuals that had to move out of the South into the industrialized North. And it's going to be a pretty awesome show.
There's also a book that we're working on that's getting close, of the sculptor Fred Eversley, who is like a light and space artist who was based in Los Angeles but now lives in New York. And they're just like super optical and like these like amazing lenses that are cast in resin, and like we've been having a lot of conversations about light and space, and I think that book's is starting to look really beautiful as
If
well.
we can use some of those high intensity inks, I am so looking forward
Oh,
to
I
that production
know, I
process. Like, so much
know.
good
I'm
stuff
excited to
there.
play with that.
What are
What
questions?
questions do you ask about the printing of each Coolpix? Yeah, that's really important. We're actually like, usually we use the separator for the printer, like when we're doing like color retouching, but this one we're using like a dedicated person who focuses on that, and there's going to be a lot of proofing, a lot of proofing and testing of things. So yeah.
But we also get to work with Fred. He's still alive.
Yeah, that's true. That's such a different
And
dynamic.
he and his girlfriend are awesome.
Yes, they are
Like,
trip. I love
they
them.
like they are funny and just fantastic to work with, and
they get design and they care about it deeply, which is super cool.
Is this your full-time job? It's now.
It is now. As of this week, I left my teaching job, and it is like going to be my full-time job. And now my full-time job is also making sure Brian can join me later this year.
Yeah, I still work full-time at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm the creative director of marketing there, because lovingly, graphic design makes some good money. Books don't make a lot of money, and I still have to pay my loans and pay my rent. So we are trying to make it where Silas and I can both be at Polymode at full time. You know, scalability is still rough. Capitalism is still a mess, and we're doing our best.
Wow, that's amazing. It's really so nice to hear about both of your experiences and everything you're all working on. And it is a joy to hear you both speak about your projects and go into so much detail and be so, again, so generous with sharing this kind of information. So I just wanted to, any last questions from the crowd? I know everyone is loving this a lot. But we do have to switch to the next studio visit, which is going to be Moniker Press from Vancouver. Super, super exciting. Thank you again, Polymode, Brian and Silas, for being here today with us. Super appreciate it. Great. We're going to take a really short break and then see you back here in, a little bit before 11, and we'll start our studio visit with Moniker. Thank you both.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Jamie and Tom. You're kicking butt, by the way. This is so cool. Like the way it's organized, that selection, the vibe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. See you both soon, hopefully.